The late afternoon sun dipped low over the quiet hills as the old steam train exhaled a tired whistle, pulling into Ashcombe village station with a mournful sigh. Miss Marple, bundled in her familiar tweed coat and clutching her time-worn handbag, stepped onto the platform with the cautious grace of someone who had seen far too much of life to ever truly relax. Ashcombe was like a painting left untouched for decades. Cobblestone lanes twisted through clusters of ivy-draped cottages, and the sweet, heavy scent of overripe apples hung in the air. Smiling politely at the curious villagers who peered at her over garden gates and from behind lace curtains, Miss Marple made her way toward Renfield Hall, where Lady Adeline Cranmore had invited her for a restful visit, though instinct told her rest would be the last thing she would find there. The great hall rose before her at the edge of the village like a ghost from another century, its stone walls weathered but proud, its gardens meticulously wild, a place where every shadow seemed to guard a forgotten story. As she passed through the heavy iron gates, a shiver thin as a thread of mist prickled the back of her neck. Inside, the drawing room glowed with firelight and the delicate clink of fine china. But even as they spoke of gardens and village fates, Miss Marple noticed the way Lady Adeline's hand trembled just slightly as she poured the tea, the way her gaze flickered once, just once, toward the closed drawing-room door. It was only after the second cup, when the sun dipped below the hills and the first fingers of twilight crept across the room, that Lady Adeline, voice barely above a whisper, spoke of the Ashcrofts, an old family whose youngest son, Jonathan, had vanished without a trace decades ago. Some said the sea took him. Others swore he had been seen wandering the cliffs by moonlight long after his supposed death. In villages like these, Lady Adeline said, her voice hollow, the earth never forgets, Jane, and sometimes neither do the dead. The fire sputtered, the shadows seemed to breathe, and Miss Marple, smiling gently but with a mind already sharpening like a blade, knew the village of Ashcombe held secrets far more dangerous, and far more alive than anyone dared to admit. Perched at the edge of the velvet chair, her gnarled fingers twisted the lace of her shawl, white with age and worry. Outside, the storm whined like a living thing, and through the moaning winds a name slipped into the room like a ghost: Thomas Greaves. Lady Mariana's hand faltered mid-stitch, her needle pricking her skin without notice. Across the room, Miss Hale observed the change at once, the sudden stiffness in Lady Mariana's posture, the way her breath caught in her chest. "A terrible fate," Lady Mariana whispered, voice thin as smoke. "They said Thomas disappeared into the marshlands, but that was no natural end." The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, who had been quietly tending the fire, froze, her knuckles whitening around the poker. "Not the marsh," she said hoarsely, so faint it was nearly a breath. "Not lost, not drowned." Lady Mariana turned sharply, her eyes wide with alarm. Mrs. Fenwick's face drained of color, and then, trembling violently, the poker slipped from her hand, clattering to the hearth. She staggered back, one hand clawing at the mantel for support, the other pressed against her heart. Her lips moved, shaping desperate words, but only broken gasps escaped, until with a final surge of will she croaked, "I saw him, digging, scraping at the earth. He was buried alive." A collective shudder swept the room, the shadows themselves seeming to lean closer. Without another word, Mrs. Fenwick crumpled to the floor, her body limp and lifeless as the last breath slipped from her. Miss Hale rushed forward, her face calm but her heart hammering, while Lady Mariana stood frozen in horror. The crackle of the fire seemed suddenly vulgar in the deep, crushing silence that followed. No one spoke, no one moved. Mrs. Fenwick, keeper of some ancient horror, had taken her final secret with her. Lady Mariana's hands shook as she clutched the back of a chair, whispering, "What does it mean, Jane?" Miss Hale, after a heavy pause, gazed down at the lifeless housekeeper, a sadness passing over her sharp features. "Not madness," she murmured to herself. "Not delirium. A truth, too dreadful to speak until the very end." She straightened slowly, her mind racing. If Mrs. Fenwick spoke true, Thomas Greaves did not vanish into the marsh by misfortune. No, someone put him there, alive. Lady Mariana gasped, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. But why stay silent all these years? Why not cry out sooner? Because fear, Miss Hale said simply, can be a prison more enduring than stone. She crouched beside the still figure, her mind replaying past cases, graves hurriedly filled, whispers in locked rooms, the thin line between accident and malevolence. Here, though it smelled of intent, of a secret carefully hidden, her gaze sharpened. Lady Mariana, Mrs. Fenwick once served the Greaves family, did she not? Long ago, Mariana confirmed, her voice hollow. But she left before Thomas ever disappeared. Or so it seemed, Miss Hale said grimly. She stood, her silhouette cutting a dark shape against the firelight. The truth was close now, breathing just beneath the surface. One thing she knew beyond doubt: the dead, no matter how deeply buried, never rested easy, and neither would she, not until the full horror behind Thomas Greaves' fate was unearthed. The fading light melted into the velvet hush of evening, as long shadows slithered across the oak-paneled room, and Lady Selina sat rigid in her high-backed chair, the fine porcelain of her teacup rattling faintly against the saucer in her trembling hands. The name, when spoken, seemed to thicken the very air between them. Theodore Ravenscroft, a name that had not graced the halls of Hartwood Manor for nearly 40 years. Miss Hargrove, seated opposite, watched keenly, noting how the older woman's eyes, usually so sharp, turned misty with a heavy, unspoken sorrow. They said he vanished into the woods, Lady Selina murmured at last, stirring her tea with slow mechanical movements. But not everything buried stays silent. The words hung there, brittle as dried leaves. Tales in the village spoke of a stormy night, of a desperate young man seen fleeing through the mist, and of how the Ravenscroft family locked their grief behind stone walls, sealing off any talk of scandal. No body had ever been found, only a torn scrap of a crimson cloak near the river's edge, and a locket snapped in two. Miss Hargrove leaned forward, sensing more secrets that twisted beneath the surface like roots strangling a tree. Some say, Lady Selina continued in a low whisper, he never left at all, that the family made sure he couldn't. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks into the gloom, and Miss Hargrove suppressed a shiver, her mind racing. In her years of quiet investigations, she had learned to recognize the taste of old guilt, and here it was, bitter and unmistakable. Lady Selina's thin fingers unfolded the day's newspaper from the table beside her, and her voice faltered as she read aloud. Edgar Ravenscroft, passed quietly at Hartwood, private interment. No public notice. Edgar, the patriarch, Theodore's elder brother, the man who had presided over the manor with an iron will ever since that terrible night. Miss Hargrove's knitting slipped from her lap, forgotten, as a terrible certainty began to coalesce in her mind. The dead had been stirring, and perhaps, just perhaps, the woods were ready to give up their ghost. The mist clung heavily to the ground, coiling around the mourners gathered outside the crumbling stone facade of St. Bartholomew's Church, as though the very earth sought to hold its secrets tight. Miss Elowyn Hartley, standing quietly near the gnarled oak at the graveyard's edge, watched the funeral proceedings with the careful detachment of someone accustomed to reading the truth beneath the rituals of sorrow. As the bell tolled mournfully over the bleak moorlands, the coffin bearing Sebastian Harrow, the patriarch of the Harrow estate, was lowered into the ground, and an uneasy ripple passed through the crowd. Whispers, no louder than the shifting wind, stirred among the villagers, tales of debts unpaid, betrayals hidden, and the long-ago disappearance of Sebastian's younger brother, a scandal too delicate to name aloud. Elowyn's sharp eyes caught it all. The stiffness in the shoulders of Sebastian's heir, the subtle, almost imperceptible tension between the widow and a man too eager with his consolations, the hurried glances toward the old Harrow crypt, veiled in ivy and silence. Then, just as the final prayer was spoken, the ancient groundskeeper, Mr. Keene, faltered, his shovel slipping from his gnarled hands with a clatter that shattered the fragile solemnity. His eyes, wide with something dangerously close to terror, darted not at the fresh grave, but toward the shadowed path leading into the woods, where long ago, it was said, the missing brother was last seen alive. Elowyn's breath caught, not with fear, but with the sharp thrill of a puzzle quickening into life. Death, she knew, rarely came alone in places such as these. It dragged old sins and buried secrets up with it. And as the mourners shuffled away, faces pale, lips tight, Elowen stayed behind, her gaze lingering on the crypt's iron gate that swung slightly in the cold wind, as if unseen hands had brushed it open. The funeral was merely the beginning. A reckoning long delayed was stirring in the roots of the Harrow bloodline, and Elowen, with a mind sharpened by curiosity and caution, intended to uncover every hidden thread before it could weave a fresh tragedy into the village's haunted tapestry. The low, mournful chime of the church bells echoed through the misty evening as mourners gathered at the edge of Blackwood Cemetery, their dark figures half swallowed by the encroaching fog. Miss Evelyn Hart, wrapped in a muted grey cloak, stood quietly apart, her sharp eyes noting every strained glance and whispered exchange. Death often peeled back the careful masks people wore, and tonight, Evelyn sensed the fragile veneer of composure cracking like thin ice. As Reverend Hale mumbled the final rites over the casket of Gregory Ashford, the once feared patriarch of Ashford Hall, Evelyn's gaze caught subtle tremors, the rigid posture of his eldest son Thomas, knuckles white against his walking cane, the way young Beatrice Ashford's hand trembled as she clutched her mother's sleeve, and the shifty, restless movements of Dr. Emery, who had signed the death certificate with remarkable speed. Near the ivy-choked family mausoleum, the groundskeeper, old Mr. Colby, lingered far too long, his cracked lips moving in frantic, soundless whispers, eyes darting toward the iron gate that led to the crypt. Evelyn's instincts prickled. This was not grief but fear rooted deep in history. When the last handful of dirt thudded onto the coffin and the crowd began to thin, she stayed hidden beneath the gnarled yew trees, catching snatches of a tense conversation between Thomas and his mother, Eleanor. "We must not stir the past," Eleanor hissed, voice taut with panic. "It's better left where it lies." Thomas's reply, low and grim, cut through the mist. "Secrets rot, mother, and their stench rises." As the final notes of the funeral hymn faded into the night, Evelyn turned her gaze toward the ancient crypt, its heavy door ajar, a faint, cold draught, sighing from within, as if the past itself was breathing, waiting, hungry for the living to remember what they had so desperately tried to bury. The fire crackled softly, casting long trembling shadows along the paneled walls of the greystone study. Miss Merrill's voice, quiet yet firm, broke the heavy silence. "You mean Felix," she said, her words hanging in the air like a faint, lingering mist. Lady Eleanora, her hands clasped tightly around her teacup, nodded once, gravely. "A young heir from a respected lineage," Miss Merrill continued, her gaze fixed thoughtfully on the flickering flames. "Vanishes without so much as a whisper of explanation. No search parties. No letters in the paper pleading for information. Not even a token inquiry. Just silence." Her voice deepened, weighted by unspoken questions. And now, all these years later, the name slips from Mrs. Lynde's dying lips like a final confession. Lady Eleanora exhaled slowly, as if releasing the ghosts of decades past. "It was not spoken of," she said bitterly. "Not because it was forgotten, but because it was forbidden. Arthur Winslow," she continued, her voice trembling with restrained anger, "was a man who prized his family's reputation above all else. Questions were an inconvenience he could not afford." Miss Merrill stirred her tea absently, her mind racing. "But unanswered questions," she murmured, "have a tendency to linger, festering in the dark until the truth forces its way to the surface." The two women sat in heavy silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock, and the whisper of the rising wind outside. Lady Eleanora's voice dropped to a near whisper, a confession almost too dangerous to speak aloud. "There were always rumors," she said, "that Felix had been wild, reckless, that he had stumbled too close to some disgrace that could ruin them all." Her fingers traced invisible circles against the armrest. "And when he disappeared, Arthur did not mourn. He merely stepped into Felix's place, seamlessly, almost eagerly, as though he had always been waiting for the moment." Miss Merrill leaned forward, her sharp eyes gleaming with a quiet intensity. Or perhaps, she said slowly, Arthur did not merely wait for the moment. Perhaps, he made it happen. The words seemed to shudder through the room, and the fire guttered low, casting strange flickering shapes across the ancient walls. Outside, a branch scraped against the window pane, a lonely grating sound that made both women stiffen. Somewhere in the dark, the past was stirring, and Miss Merrill knew with cold certainty that Greystone Manor was not finished giving up its secrets. Lady Eleanora fell silent at last, her gaze distant, as if seeing ghosts the rest of the world had long forgotten. And no one questioned him, she said bitterly. Not the family, not the villagers, not even the authorities. Miss Merrill set her cup down with a delicate clink, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her eyes thoughtful. A family of such esteem, such impeccable influence, she murmured, can make a scandal vanish as easily as a shadow at sunset. One missing heir, one closed chapter. Lady Eleanora's brow furrowed, a deep line of unease cutting across her usually serene expression. But that is what unsettles me most, Jane, she whispered. Not that Felix disappeared, but how easily the world seemed to forget him, as if his absence were a mere inconvenience. Miss Merrill tapped a finger against the polished wood of the table, a small rhythmic sound. Ah, but dear Eleanora, she said, a glint sparking in her eye, perhaps not everyone has forgotten, and perhaps it is time, long overdue, that someone asks the questions that were buried along with the past. As evening deepened into a hushed twilight, Miss Merrill made her way through the churchyard, her footsteps slow and deliberate over the uneven stones. The last light of day bled across the moss-covered graves, stretching their shadows into strange crooked forms. Beyond the ancient headstones stood a small weathered cottage, its crooked chimney curling smoke into the cooling air. Outside, Mr. Tully, the caretaker, a bent and wiry figure molded by years of quiet labor, stood polishing the old brass lanterns with a slow hypnotic motion. At Miss Merrill's approach, he straightened stiffly, lifting his cap in a gesture of cautious respect. Even in Miss Merrill, he rasped, his voice rough like gravel underfoot. Not often we see visitors at this hour. Miss Merrill smiled, her expression as pleasant as ever, though her mind raced beneath the surface. I was admiring the stillness, she said softly. There's something comforting about a place so full of memory, don't you think? Mr. Tully grunted, non-committal. Peaceful enough, for them as earned it. Miss Merrill let the words linger in the air between them, then stepped closer, her voice dropping just enough to draw him in. I imagine you know every soul resting here, she said warmly. The old man nodded, wiping his cloth across the tarnished brass with a slow, thoughtful swipe. Seen 'em all come and go one by one. Miss Merrill's gaze flickered toward the looming silhouette of the Winslow crypt, its iron gates rusted but still imposing. She lowered her voice further, the question slipping out like a secret. And the Winslow crypt? Surely it holds more than just names on stone. Surely it holds stories. For a heartbeat, something fear perhaps, or guilt flashed across Mr. Tully's lined face, so quick it could almost have been missed. But Miss Merrill missed nothing, and in that fleeting moment, she knew the past was not as dead and buried as everyone pretended. Tulliver's knotted fingers tightened imperceptibly around the worn rag in his hand, his weathered face betraying a shadow of fear he clearly wished to hide. Miss Merrill's voice, gentle and unwavering, pressed forward like a candle against deep fog. I happened to notice, Mr. Tulliver, she said softly, how uneasy you looked near the Winslow crypt during the funeral, as if something weighed on your mind heavier than grief. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes drifting toward the hulking outline of the ancient tomb, half swallowed by the evening mist. Ain't my place to talk, Miss Merrill, he muttered. But she only smiled, kind, patient, the kind of smile that loosened the oldest knots in a man's soul. Sometimes, she said, speaking the burden aloud is the only way to set it down. Mr. Tulliver exhaled a slow, rattling breath, his hands moving restlessly over the cloth. Some graves, he said hoarsely, don't like bein' disturbed. And some don't like bein' forgotten neither. His voice dropped lower, trembling with a fear so real it thickened the air between them. He glanced around, nervous, guilty, before leaning closer. Felix Winslow, he whispered, as if the very name might call down curses. That name's been buried longer than the man himself, if you catch my meanin'. Miss Merrill nodded slightly, her eyes sharpening though her face remained serene. Mr. Tulliver's voice cracked as he continued. It were years ago, just after they sealed the Winslow crypt for good. I was young then, eager to prove my worth. I remember standing there, watching the stone lowered, and feeling. He broke off, shivering, despite the mild air. Miss Merrill leaned in, her voice a silken thread. Feeling what, Mr. Tulliver? He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, like there was something wrong, like the ground itself was uneasy. That grave, it never did rest right. He rubbed his shaking hands together, as if trying to wash away the memory. Every time I pass it, I feel it, like a breath against my neck, like something waiting just beneath the stone. Miss Merrill's gaze didn't waver, and now she said softly, with Arthur Winslow dead too. Mr. Tulliver only nodded, fear closing his throat. The meaning was clear enough. Whatever had been locked away was stirring once more. Folding her hands neatly, Miss Merrill gazed into the gathering dusk. A grave that refused to be forgotten, a past that refused to stay buried. And perhaps at long last, it was time for the dead to be heard. As the mist thickened, and the moon bled a sickly light across the weathered stones, St. Luke's churchyard came alive with the groan of iron tools and the low, urgent murmur of workers. Cold under the cover of night, they gathered to reinforce the decaying Winslow crypt. But Miss Merrill knew in her bones what they would find was not merely crumbling stone, but secrets meant never to see the light of day. The task was meant to be a simple one. Reinforce the old Winslow crypt, secure the crumbling stones before the earth could claim them completely. The workers, weary from years of labor, didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, but the land had other plans. The first sign of something amiss came with a hollow, echoing thud, followed by the jarring scrape of a spade against something far too soft. The worker, his brow furrowed, struck again. This time, the soil gave way far too easily, crumbling inward like dust, exposing a dark outline beneath the surface, a shape that had been hidden for far too long. Lanterns were raised, their beams quivering in the damp air as the men gathered closer. One of them, his voice a whisper of disbelief, muttered, "What in God's name?" The light fell upon a coffin, its sides scarred, wedged into the earth at an awkward angle, as if it had been forced there, buried not by fate, but by someone with a deep need to conceal it. Silence descended like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. The men stood frozen, eyes wide with growing unease. It was a coffin that shouldn't have been there, a hidden relic of the past, thrust into a corner where no one dared to look. "It's not marked," one of the workers said, his voice trembling, as he studied the plain, unadorned wood. No name, no headstone to identify the dead within. Another worker took a cautious step backward, glancing around nervously. "Shouldn't be here at all." The foreman, a hardened man with little patience for superstition, hesitated for only a moment before his voice rang out with grim resolve. "Get the crowbars." The workers began their grim task, and the moment the crowbars sank into the edges of the coffin, the air seemed to shift, heavy with anticipation. With a slow, agonizing creak, the lid was pried open, and the first gust of chilled air rushed from the grave, making their breath catch. Then all at once they recoiled, a collective gasp escaping their lips as they stepped back. The coffin's contents were far more disturbing than they could have imagined. Inside, the skeleton of a man lay curled in on itself, the bones contorted, as though in the throes of some desperate final struggle. But it wasn't the twisted bones that made the men shudder. No, it was the coffin lid itself. The wood, once smooth and unblemished, now bore deep, frenzied claw marks, scratches that scored the surface as if someone had fought with every ounce of strength to escape, their fingers desperately tearing at the wood in a final horrifying attempt at freedom. The workers were frozen in place, eyes wide with the horrifying realization. Felix Winslow had not been dead when he was placed in this coffin. No, he had been buried alive. The very thought was enough to send one of the men stumbling backward, his legs trembling beneath him. The truth, buried for decades, was clawing its way back to the surface, and with it, a nightmare far worse than anything they had ever imagined. The worker, still shaking, made the sign of the cross, his lips moving in a silent prayer. His breath came in ragged gasps as his eyes flitted from the coffin to the rusted plaque partially buried in the dirt. His voice, barely more than a whisper, cracked as he spoke. He tried to get out, he muttered, his eyes wide with horror, but before he could finish, a flicker of light danced across the rusted metal plaque, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. The lantern's glow revealed the name etched into its surface: Felix Winslow, 1885. 1902. The year was the only thing that made sense, but the words made no sense at all. Felix Winslow had never been declared dead, and yet, here he was, sealed in a crypt that had for decades claimed him to be gone. The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of the discovery pressing on the workers like a suffocating blanket. Time seemed to slow. Felix Winslow had been buried alive, and after all these years, decades even, he had finally been found. Somewhere in the distance, the eerie chime of the clock struck midnight, its haunting sound carrying across the churchyard, marking the passing of time in a place where time had seemed to stand still. The coffin lay half exposed beneath the earth, its wood warped by age, the surface cracked and weathered. One of the workers, pale and trembling, stumbled forward, his hands shaking as he reached for something buried just beneath the surface, a small glint of metal. With shaking hands, he wiped the dirt from the object, revealing the plaque. The inscription was faded, corroded by time, but still legible. Felix Winslow, 1885, 1902. A deep, unsettling chill spread through the workers as they gathered around, their faces drained of color. One of them, his voice trembling, broke the silence. But Felix Winslow was never declared dead, was he? Just then Miss Marple arrived. She had appeared quietly, almost unnoticed, as though drawn to the scene by some instinctive pull. Her face was composed but her mind raced. She had seen many unsettling things in her time, but this was something else. A coffin with the name of a young man, Felix Winslow, who by all accounts had simply vanished. A man who should have been a memory, buried in the past, yet here he was, entombed beneath the very crypt, meant to house his legacy. The crypt had held his name for decades, but not his body. And now, it seemed that body had been waiting in silence, buried far deeper than anyone could have imagined. The foreman shifted uncomfortably, his throat tight. "It don't make sense, ma'am," he said, his voice hesitant. "If he wasn't declared dead, how the devil did he end up here, sealed away like this?" His words hung in the air like a cold breeze. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, unwavering, though her mind churned with questions that were only beginning to unravel. "An excellent question," she murmured, her voice low but clear, "and one that, I fear, carries a very unpleasant answer." She took a slow step forward, her eyes tracing the faded inscription. Felix Winslow had vanished in 1902, an ordinary young man, full of life and promise. Yet someone had known the truth, someone who had buried him here, far from the eyes of the world, and hidden a terrible secret for far too long. A secret that was now clawing its way back to the surface. The air hung heavy with a chill that gnawed at the bones, and the workers exchanged uneasy glances. Their earlier bravado, their whispered jokes and fleeting moments of defiance, now seemed hollow in the face of the grim discovery. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. This was no ordinary grave. It wasn't simply a resting place for the dead. It was a secret, buried in haste and obscured by layers of lies, so carefully constructed that its existence had remained hidden for decades. And now, that secret, long buried beneath the weight of time, was rising to the surface, demanding to be uncovered. Miss Marple stood motionless beside the coffin, her gloved hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if to steady her thoughts. The wind tugged at the edges of her coat, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already working furiously, piecing together the scattered fragments of the puzzle, each new clue sharpening her growing sense of dread. Felix Winslow had not been claimed by the sea, as many had whispered in hushed tones over the years. He hadn't run away, fleeing from some unknown scandal. No, the truth was far darker. He had been buried here, beneath the crypt that should have been a monument to his legacy, hidden away with the full knowledge that no one would ever ask questions. Her gaze flickered once more to the coffin's lid, the jagged claw-like marks carved deeply into the wood. The scratches were so frenzied, so desperate, that they told a tale of someone fighting not just for their life, but for their very breath. Felix had been alive when he was sealed in there, alive and terrified. He hadn't been allowed the mercy of death. He had been condemned to a fate worse than that: silence. Miss Marple's voice broke the stillness, soft but certain, the word hanging in the air like a cold knife. Murder. The word was a cold truth, rising from the depths of her suspicion into the chilling clarity of reality. One of the workers shifted uncomfortably, his voice wavering as he finally found the courage to speak. "But why, ma'am? Why bury him like this? Why hide him at all?" Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, met his with a gaze that could see through the veil of fear and confusion. Felix Winslow wasn't meant to be found. He was meant to vanish completely, to become nothing more than a ghost story, a forgotten tragedy. Whoever did this wanted the world to forget he ever existed. Her voice was low, filled with the weight of the revelation, yet she could not shake the gnawing feeling that there was more, far more to this mystery than she had yet uncovered. A tense silence fell over the group. The realization that this wasn't the result of some tragic accident or a misunderstanding began to settle in. This was deliberate. The very idea that someone had taken such calculated steps to ensure Felix's death remained a secret for so long sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. Whoever had buried him had done so with intent, not out of ignorance, but because they had something far more dangerous to hide. Miss Marple turned away from the coffin, her mind racing. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. She had uncovered the first clue, the dark truth buried in the earth. But she knew one more thing, one last chilling fact. Whoever had orchestrated this had made one critical mistake. They had hidden the body, but they had not hidden the truth. And now that truth was clawing its way out, and Miss Marple would not rest until it had been fully unearthed. The shadows of the past had a way of creeping up, and when they did, the cost of silence would be unimaginable. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always found their way to the surface eventually, and Miss Marple knew it better than anyone. The fire in the drawing room crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room, but Miss Marple scarcely noticed. She sat in her usual chair, her hands neatly folded in her lap, her knitting forgotten beside her, untouched. Her thoughts, however, were far from idle. She was unraveling a thread, one she had been pulling at ever since she set foot in Greystone Village. The discovery of Felix Winslow's coffin had confirmed what her instincts had long whispered. This was no accident. Felix had not disappeared of his own accord. He had been removed, buried, and silenced. But the true question lingered in the air like a suffocating fog. Why? She replayed the moments from the past few days, each conversation, each subtle glance, each passing comment. Her mind sifted through them like a detective, reviewing evidence. Mr. Tully's fearful murmurings about graves that don't rest easy. The warnings from Vivian Winslow, telling her husband, dig too deep, and you might not like what you find. Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she thought of Dr. Graves, who had avoided the coffin as though it might accuse him of something unforgivable. But most of all, it was Arthur Winslow that haunted her thoughts. The man who had benefited the most from Felix's disappearance. The man who had, for all intents and purposes, taken control of the Winslow estate immediately after his brother's vanishing. Her fingers tapped lightly against the armrest of her chair, each tap a slow and deliberate motion. The pieces were all there, scattered across her thoughts, like a patchwork puzzle. One loose thread, one small revelation, would unravel the entire design. She could feel it, like a scent carried on the wind. She only needed to find it. She reached for her teacup, but the liquid had long since gone cold. Arthur Winslow had assumed control of the family estate. Yes, but that was only part of the story. The Winslows, with their wealth and old traditions, had always been known for their impeccable status. But wealth, Miss Marple knew all too well, could be a fragile thing. Fortunes could dwindle, and when that happened, desperation had a way of making people do unspeakable things. Lady Eleanor had alluded to it before. Felix had been the rightful heir. As the younger son, his inheritance should have been smaller than Arthur's. But the rumors that had clung to the Winslow family like smoke for years painted a different picture. Whispers suggested that their father had planned to divide the estate differently. Had Felix lived, the family fortune might have gone to him, not Arthur. A sharp realization cut through Miss Marple's thoughts. If Arthur stood to lose everything, the wealth, the estate, the power, then Felix had become more than just an heir. He had become a threat that could be easily removed, buried under a web of lies, and forgotten by all. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, and she considered a darker possibility. What if Felix had known something? What if he had uncovered a secret so dangerous, so damning, that it had sealed his fate? Her pulse quickened as the pieces began to come together, each new thought building on the last, creating a web of intrigue that no one in Greystone Village could have anticipated. Felix Winslow had been silenced, but not for the reasons everyone assumed. And Miss Marple was determined to discover the truth, no matter where it led her, or how dark the path might become. The truth was as dangerous as it was elusive, a secret that Arthur Winslow could not afford to let Felix reveal. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line as she considered the implications. This was no simple matter of inheritance. This was about control, the kind of control that Arthur had ruthlessly secured in the most final way imaginable. Felix's death had not been an accident or a natural occurrence. It had been orchestrated with cold, calculating precision. And now, standing on the brink of uncovering the truth, Miss Marple knew that the stakes were higher than ever before. With a soft click, she picked up her knitting once more, the needles moving in practiced rhythm. But her thoughts were far from the simplicity of her hands' movements. The loose ends were starting to come together, and the tangled web that had ensnared Felix Winslow was slowly starting to unravel. The truth was close now, within reach. All she needed was the final piece to pull it all together, to bring the buried secrets into the light where they belonged. Her fingers brushed the edge of the armrest, as her mind wandered again to the name that had kept surfacing. Dr. Graves. His name had lingered in every conversation, every piece of evidence like a shadow following Felix's disappearance. He had signed a death certificate for a man who had never been declared dead, for a body that had only just now been discovered, hidden deep beneath the Winslow crypt. The very fact that Dr. Graves had done so without a body was enough to raise suspicions, but the signs of guilt were all too visible. The man had behaved as though the weight of his actions was crushing him. His avoidance of eye contact at the funeral, his visible distress when the coffin was discovered. Guilt, Miss Marple thought with certainty. She had seen it before, and she could see it now. The pieces began to fall into place, and Miss Marple's mind churned with the possibilities. Had Dr. Graves been coerced into silence, forced into this lie at the behest of someone far more powerful? If Arthur Winslow had orchestrated Felix's disappearance, he would have needed someone trusted, someone with authority, to legitimize the false narrative. Dr. Graves had played that role, but the question was, had he done so willingly, or was he complicit, an active participant in the cover-up? Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she considered the deeper layers of the mystery. If Felix had truly died, if his death had been natural or even an accident, why was there no record of it? Why had no death certificate been filed publicly? Why had there been no inquiry, no investigation? Instead, there had been nothing, just a deliberate silence, a carefully manufactured void, where any trace of Felix Winslow's death should have been. That silence was the real answer. Miss Marple realized. But Dr. Graves had signed something. Something official, something that had made it all appear legitimate. She paused, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, as the realization began to solidify. What kind of doctor pronounces a man dead without a body? A doctor who is frightened, perhaps, or one who has something to gain from keeping the truth buried. Miss Marple's mind sharpened at the thought. She suspected it was the former. Dr. Graves was no opportunist. He wasn't the type of man who stood to profit from Felix's death, but he was haunted by it. That, Miss Marple knew, was a weakness, a crack in the carefully built wall of deception, and cracks, once exposed, had a way of growing wider, of revealing the truth behind them. Her lips pressed together again as she mentally catalogued the facts. The man had signed off on a lie so great that it had shattered the lives of the Winslow family. But now the layers of that lie were beginning to peel back, and with each revelation, Miss Marple felt the tightening coil of tension unraveling at her fingertips. She couldn't help but wonder what Dr. Graves knew, what he feared, and what part he had played in a deception that reached farther than anyone had ever imagined. The horrifying revelation of Felix Winslow's condition hit Miss Marple like a bolt of lightning. He had been declared dead, yet he was never truly dead at all. The ghastly discovery of claw marks inside his coffin painted a chilling picture. The desperate struggle of a man trapped in a sealed tomb, fighting against the darkness that suffocated him, brought with it a new level of fear. Felix Winslow had suffered before he died, if he had even died at all. And now there was a doctor who carried secrets heavy enough to break anyone. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Her thoughts flashed to a case she had read about many years ago, an unsettling, rare condition called catalepsy. A condition so rare, it could mimic death itself. The symptoms were so subtle that only the most trained eyes could differentiate between a truly deceased body and one that had simply been in a deep, unresponsive state. Had Felix Winslow suffered from catalepsy? Had he truly been alive when they buried him? The question gnawed at her, and a cold chill crept down her spine as she considered the implications. What if the entire scenario had been nothing more than a tragic mistake? But if it had been a mistake, how could Arthur Winslow have been so certain his brother was dead? And what about Dr. Graves? Had the good doctor realized too late? Or was he simply too afraid to admit the truth? Miss Marple's suspicion sharpened like a blade. She needed to confront Dr. Graves. Only he could hold the key to the mystery now. And it was time for a conversation with him, one that would reveal the buried truths. As night fell, Miss Marple arrived at Dr. Graves's study. The air was thick with the pungent scent of pipe tobacco, and the mustiness of old books. The dim glow of a single desk lamp flickered softly, casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. She took a seat across from the doctor, who seemed unnervingly tense. His fingers tightened around his glass of brandy, and his posture was stiff. Too stiff. Miss Marple's face remained calm, serene even, but beneath her quiet exterior, her mind was calculating. She could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of the questions she was about to ask. Such a dreadful business. Miss Marple began softly, her tone almost conversational, but there was an underlying edge to her words. Finding poor Felix Winslow after all these years. One can only imagine the shock. Dr. Graves exhaled slowly, his eyes darting to the glass in his hand. Yes, quite a terrible thing, he muttered, but his voice faltered just slightly, betraying the tension that lay beneath the surface. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on him, as if studying him. I dare say it must be especially difficult for you, Doctor, she continued, her voice soft but firm. After all, you signed the death certificate, did you not? At the mention of the death certificate, Dr. Graves's hand jerked ever so slightly, spilling a drop of brandy onto the rim of the glass. His gaze flickered toward her for a brief second before quickly averting. Yes. Well, I did what was necessary at the time, he stammered, his words growing more hesitant by the second. At the time. Miss Marple's voice was a quiet murmur, but the weight of the question hung in the air like an ominous storm cloud. "A curious phrase," she said, her eyes never leaving his face. The doctor's discomfort was palpable now. His fingers clenched around the glass, his knuckles white, and the tension in the room was suffocating. Miss Marple's suspicion was growing. There was more to Dr. Graves's involvement than he was willing to admit. She leaned forward slightly, her calm demeanor unwavering, but the force of her words was undeniable. "Tell me, doctor," she said. "What exactly did you know at the time? And why the delay in reporting the truth?" A silence fell between them, thick with unspoken words. Dr. Graves's eyes darted around the room, avoiding her gaze. The weight of the truth was too heavy for him to bear, and Miss Marple could feel it. The hour of reckoning had arrived. Only one thing was certain now. The truth was waiting to be uncovered, and Miss Marple would not rest until it was revealed in all its terrifying clarity. Dr. Graves's fingers trembled as he reached for his handkerchief, dabbing at his forehead. His usually composed demeanor was cracking under the weight of Miss Marple's pointed questions. "Miss Marple," he stammered, his voice shaking slightly, "I'm not sure what you're insinuating." "But oh, nothing at all," she interrupted, her voice soft yet laced with a subtle undercurrent of challenge. "It's just that it seems rather unfortunate, doesn't it? That Felix Winslow's death was never officially recorded as such. And yet there it was, hidden away, all this time, as if nothing had happened." The air in the room grew thick with unspoken tension. Dr. Graves's hand tightened around his glass, the muscles in his jaw twitching with the strain of the conversation. Miss Marple's calm, unwavering presence only seemed to deepen the pressure. She leaned in ever so slightly, her voice lowering, as if coaxing the truth out of him in the most delicate manner. "Wouldn't it be easier to unburden yourself, doctor? I do believe you've carried this weight for far too long." For a brief moment, silence enveloped them, heavy and suffocating. Dr. Graves sat still, as though his very thoughts were too dangerous to voice. But after what felt like an eternity, the doctor slumped forward, rubbing a weary hand over his face, as if trying to ward off the guilt that seemed to be consuming him. Finally his voice broke the silence, a shuddering sigh escaping him. "You don't understand," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "I had no choice." Miss Marple, with her ever unflappable composure, said nothing. She allowed the silence to stretch out, giving him the space to confess, to unearth the secrets buried beneath the surface. After another long, ragged breath, Dr. Graves continued, his gaze distant, lost in the haze of memory. "Felix wasn't dead," he murmured, the words hanging between them, heavy with irrevocable truth. Miss Marple's expression didn't shift, but a subtle tightness in her grip on the fabric of her dress betrayed the careful control she maintained over her own emotions. "Go on," she urged softly, her voice coaxing him to continue, to lay bare the dark reality that had been kept hidden for so long. Dr. Graves exhaled sharply, as though summoning the strength to speak the truth he had buried for years. "Felix Winslow suffered from a rare condition, catalepsy," he said, his voice shaky with the weight of his confession. "A state where the body slows down to a near-death state, the pulse barely detectable, even to an experienced physician. It's as though life has simply fled the body, leaving it a shell behind." Miss Marple nodded, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "But it hadn't had it, doctor." The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Dr. Graves swallowed hard. "No," he replied, his voice cracking with the admission. "Felix Winslow was alive when they put him into that coffin. I examined him. I should have been more thorough. His body was cold. His pulse was absent. But I should have known. I should have waited. But Arthur Winslow pressured me. He said Felix was a disgrace, a scandal waiting to happen. He said his death would be better for everyone involved." Miss Marple's expression remained as unreadable as ever, but the weight of Dr. Graves' words was undeniable. "And so you signed the death certificate," she said softly. But there was a cold edge to her voice now, as if the full depth of the doctor's betrayal had finally been laid bare. The room seemed to grow colder, as Dr. Graves' confession settled in, His shoulders slumped, and the haunted look in his eyes told the story of a man who had never been able to escape the guilt of his decision. He had sealed Felix Winslow's fate with a single signature, but in doing so, he had condemned them both. And now Miss Marple had uncovered the truth. A truth that would unravel everything. Dr. Graves' voice cracked as he spoke, his admission heavy with decades of guilt. Yes, I signed the death certificate. And they buried him. His eyes closed, and a shudder racked his body. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. Miss Marple watched him, her expression calm but unwavering. She knew that guilt could wear down even the strongest of men, and Dr. Graves had clearly carried his burden for far too long. But the truth, she knew, had a way of demanding to be known, no matter how deep it was buried. The doctor pressed his hands to his face, his shoulders trembling with the weight of his confession. I've lived with this for over 40 years, Mrs. Marple, he said, his voice raw. I told myself it wasn't my fault, that I couldn't have known. Miss Marple remained silent, her gaze never leaving him. After a long, deliberate pause, she rose from her seat, her movements slow and deliberate. Guilt is a heavy burden, doctor, she murmured, her voice soft but firm. And the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, has a way of finding its way to the surface. She turned toward the door, her mind already set on the task ahead. There was only one thing left to do now. Bring Felix Winslow's murderer to justice. The night had settled over Greystone like a thick, oppressive blanket. The usual peaceful calm of the village felt suffocating, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Miss Marple, tucked away in the guest room of Greystone Manor, had retired early, but sleep eluded her. Dr. Graves' confession lingered in her thoughts, gnawing at her. Felix Winslow hadn't been dead when they buried him. And someone close to him, someone with a dark agenda, had made sure he never woke up. The truth, she knew, was never a simple thing. It had a way of unsettling those who preferred the past to remain undisturbed. It could shake the very foundation of everything. And Miss Marple was certain that there was still more to uncover. As she lay in bed trying to quiet the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind, the house seemed to groan under its own weight. The faint creak of settling wood echoed in the silence, followed by the distant hoot of an owl. But then, something shifted. A noise subtle yet distinct, a floorboard creaking. Her breath stilled. The sound had come from just outside her door. Miss Marple's sharp eyes flickered to the thin strip of darkness beneath the doorframe. A shadow moved there, not the flickering, shifting shadow of candlelight, but something far more deliberate. Someone was standing outside watching her, waiting. She remained perfectly still, her hands folded lightly over the blankets, her mind racing. Whoever stood outside her door wasn't just passing by. They were there for a reason. The air in the room seemed to constrict, the silence growing thicker with each passing second. Then the faintest click, the unmistakable sound of a door handle turning. Her pulse remained steady, calm. Miss Marple had never been one to give in to fear. She was not a fool. She was not alone. The door shifted ever so slightly, just enough for the faintest crack of light to slip through. And then stillness. Whoever stood on the other side had hesitated. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the silence felt suffocating. Miss Marple, ever calm and poised, reached for the heavy silver candlestick beside her bed. Her fingers tightened around its cold, solid weight, a reassuring anchor in the midst of rising tension. Her mind was sharp, calculating, her thoughts steady as the intruder on the other side prepared for whatever was to come. Without warning, the door burst open with a force that sent a rush of air through the room. A dark figure lunged forward, swift, silent, moving with the deadly precision of someone who had done this before. Miss Marple didn't flinch, not a whisper of fear in her. She never screamed. That was not her way. Instead, she did the most unexpected thing. She stepped aside, allowing the figure to rush past her. The intruder, expecting an easy target, nothing more than a fragile old woman, was thrown off balance. Just a moment, but that was all Miss Marple needed. She swung the candlestick with a practiced, fluid motion. its cold metal connecting with the figure just beneath the shoulder. The attacker staggered back, a muffled curse escaping their lips. In that instant the room was no longer just a guest room in an old manor. It became a battlefield, a deadly game of survival. The figure recovered, stumbling toward the door, but Miss Marple was already one step ahead. She moved quickly, almost imperceptibly, her breath steady, her senses heightened. She peered into the corridor outside, but it was empty. The intruder had vanished, melted into the shadows like a ghost. She stood there for a moment, the echoes of the encounter still reverberating in her mind. Her fingers tightened once more around the cold candlestick. The murderer was still alive, and they were afraid. Later, in Lady Elena's grand drawing room, the fire crackled softly, its flames casting eerie, shifting shadows along the stone walls. The heavy curtains were drawn, sealing out the cold night air, but within the room there was an undeniable chill, one that had little to do with the weather, and everything to do with the unspoken truths that hung in the air. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, her usual mild expression unchanged, her knitting resting neatly in her lap. But if one looked closely, they would see the sharpness in her gaze, the quiet certainty in her posture. She knew that the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. The gathered suspects were arrayed before her, their faces masks of curiosity, impatience, and barely concealed anxiety. Edmund Winslow stood by the window, his arms crossed, his brow furrowed in deep thought. His wife Vivienne stood beside him, her eyes flickering between the other guests. But it was clear, the tension in the room had reached a boiling point. Each person in that room knew they were on the precipice of something dangerous, something that would change everything. And Miss Marple, ever composed, was the calm at the center of the storm. The room was thick with tension, as the suspects sat in uneasy silence. Dr. Graves, pale and hollow-eyed, stared down at his trembling hands, deliberately avoiding eye contact with anyone. His face was etched with the weight of guilt, a guilt he could neither escape nor deny. Mr. Tully, the aging caretaker, sat perched on the edge of his chair, his hands nervously twisting his cap, as though seeking comfort in its worn fabric. Lady Elena, regal as ever, sat at the head of the room, her gaze sweeping over the group with quiet but unwavering scrutiny. Her demeanor was composed, but there was something in the air, a subtle undercurrent of fear, of anticipation. Miss Marple, as always, broke the silence. Her voice, though calm and pleasant, carried an unmistakable authority. "I thought it best that we all meet this evening. There are matters that must be addressed." Her words hung in the air, a signal that what was to follow would be no ordinary conversation. She let the silence stretch just a moment longer, as if to draw everyone into the weight of what she was about to reveal. "Felix Winslow's disappearance," she continued, her voice steady, long considered an unsolvable mystery, "is no longer quite so mysterious. His fate, tragic as it is, has now come to light." She paused, watching each person closely, noting the subtle shifts in their expressions. "And so it is time, I think, to discuss the question that lingers: who precisely is responsible?" A hush fell over the room, even the crackling fire seemed to falter, as if it too was aware of the tension building. The flickering light only deepened the shadows around them, casting long distorted shapes on the walls. No one spoke. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the gathered suspects, each one now visibly bracing themselves. She spoke again, her voice cutting through the silence with surgical precision. "The motive, of course, was money. It so often is." Edmund Winslow, who had been standing by the window with his arms crossed, shifted uncomfortably at the mention of money, his brow furrowing slightly. Vivienne, sitting beside him, gripped the arm of her chair, her fingers white with tension. Miss Marple continued, her tone deceptively casual, almost as if discussing the weather. "Felix Winslow was the favored son. Though Arthur was the elder, there were whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, that their father intended to change his will. It was said that Felix, not Arthur, would inherit the lion's share of the Winslow estate." She let her words hang in the air, knowing the effect they would have. Edmund's head snapped toward her, his expression unreadable. "That's nonsense," he declared, quickly, though the lack of conviction in his voice betrayed him. Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes sharp as she met his gaze. "Perhaps," she said, her smile widening slightly. "But if it were true, Arthur Winslow would have had every reason to see Felix removed. And conveniently, that is exactly what happened." The room seemed to tighten, each person on edge, waiting for her next words. The silence that followed was palpable, each suspect lost in their thoughts, their hearts pounding in their chests. Miss Marple's voice broke the stillness once more, deceptively mild, as though she were still simply making an observation. "Felix did not drown at sea, nor did he run away." Her gaze swept across the room, ensuring every person felt the weight of her words. "He was buried alive." The room seemed to hold its breath, every eye locked on Miss Marple, but no one dared to speak. The truth had been laid bare, and now the walls of this carefully constructed facade were crumbling before them. What had seemed like a long-forgotten mystery was now an undeniable reality. And in that moment, the tension in the room reached its breaking point, each person feeling the suffocating pressure of the revelation. Who would crack next? Who was hiding the truth? Miss Marple's voice, so calm and composed, was the only thing keeping the room from descending into chaos. The game was no longer about finding the truth, it was about surviving the consequences of knowing it. Hidden away beneath the shadows of the family crypt, Vivienne let out a quiet, almost imperceptible breath, her posture stiff, as though every inch of her was bracing for what was to come. "Doctor." Graves flinched at the sound but said nothing, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Miss Marple, however, turned her gaze slowly toward him, her expression as calm and calculating as ever. "Of course," she began softly, her voice carrying a weight of understanding that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. "Arthur Winslow could not have arranged this alone. He needed help, someone who could provide him with the necessary confirmation that Felix was no longer an obstacle to his ambitions." Her eyes locked onto Dr. Graves, and he immediately felt a chill run down his spine. His fingers twitched involuntarily, but he kept his gaze fixed to the floor, unwilling to meet the eyes of the woman who seemed to see straight through him. Miss Marple didn't need to speak again. Her eyes said everything. The room held its breath as all eyes turned toward Dr. Graves. The once respected doctor, a man who had spent his career tending to the health of Greystone Village, now sat ashen-faced, his hands trembling ever so slightly against his knee. He knew this moment was coming, yet no amount of preparation could have steeled him for the weight of what was about to unfold. Miss Marple's voice broke the silence once more, deceptively gentle but laced with an underlying intensity. "Doctor," she asked, her words slow and deliberate, "would you care to explain how you came to sign the death certificate of a man who was not dead?" The room seemed to freeze. The air thickened, the tension almost suffocating. "Doctor." Graves' throat tightened, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths as the truth threatened to tear free from his lips. A long, agonizing silence stretched between them. Then, finally, "Doctor." Graves exhaled a shaky breath, his shoulders sagging as though the very weight of his guilt was pressing him into the ground. "Arthur Winslow came to me," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "He said Felix had fallen ill, collapsed. When I arrived, his body was cold, his pulse weak, undetectable." He paused, his hands gripping his knees tightly, as though the very act of speaking was a physical effort. "But I should have waited. I should have been certain." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through, the words tumbling out in a rush of remorse. "Arthur insisted there was no need for an examination. He said it was family business, that his father would want the burial to be swift. And he swallowed hard, the truth too bitter to taste. "I agreed. I signed the papers. I didn't question it. I didn't ask any more questions. I thought it was the only way." The room was utterly still, save for the sound of a collective breath being held. A murmur of shock rippled through the gathered group, but Miss Marple remained composed. Her gaze never wavered from Dr. Graves as she spoke, her tone as smooth as silk, but with a sharpness that cut through the air like a knife. "A coward perhaps, Doctor," she said softly, her words landing like a hammer, "but not the only one responsible. Arthur Winslow may have secured the inheritance, but it was not he who kept this secret buried for 40 years. Her eyes flicked toward the others in the room, each one suddenly feeling the weight of her gaze upon them, as though they too were complicit in this tragic charade. The truth was no longer a mere whisper in the wind. It was a storm, and they were all caught in its path. Vivienne, who had remained eerily silent for far too long, now looked up, her gaze fixed but distant. The air in the room seemed to grow even heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on the truth. Miss Marple, who had watched Vivienne closely, now allowed the smallest of smiles to play at the corner of her lips. It was not a smile of kindness, but one of subtle triumph, as if the game was nearing its final move. "I do believe, Lady Winslow," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but cutting through the thick silence like a blade, "that you have something to add." A deep, almost suffocating silence descended on the room, its weight pressing against each of their hearts, forcing them into stillness. The crackling of the fire seemed to grow quieter, as if even the flames dared not disturb the tension hanging in the air. Miss Marple's breath was steady, but every word she spoke carried the gravity of a truth long buried, ready to tear the family apart. "There is one last truth to be told," she continued, her voice unyielding, "and it is the most terrible of all." The words hung in the air, their impact sinking into the minds of those present. Not one person moved. Even the air itself seemed to hold its breath, the space between the living and the truth narrowing with every second. Vivienne's hand flew to her mouth, her chest rising and falling with quiet but frantic breaths. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Dr. Graves, already pale, now appeared utterly drained of color, his hands shaking as if the weight of the revelation had physically drained him. Even Lady Eleanor, so poised and regal, turned her face away, the shock evident in her usually composed features. Miss Marple took a slow, deliberate breath, her gaze sweeping across the room one final time. "Felix Winslow did not die on the night he was buried," she declared, her voice unwavering, but the words themselves struck with the force of a thunderclap. A collective gasp filled the room. The truth was more chilling than any of them could have imagined. The very air in the room felt charged with an energy that made the firelight flicker uncertainly, casting elongated shadows across their faces. Vivienne's hand trembled, her fingers pressed tightly against her mouth as if to suppress the scream that seemed to claw at her throat. Dr. Graves was so white that it appeared his very soul had left him. His hands trembled uncontrollably, the very foundation of his world shattering before him. Lady Eleanor, whose composure had always been a hallmark, now averted her eyes, unwilling to meet the gaze of the others. "The scratches inside the coffin," Miss Marple continued, her tone taking on a grave softness, "were not those of a man who was already gone. No, they were the desperate, frantic marks of a man clawing at the very wood that trapped him. A man fighting to breathe, fighting to escape, fighting for his life." Vivienne's breath caught in her throat. The horror of the image Miss Marple painted felt unbearable, almost too much to comprehend. Edmund's voice broke as if he had swallowed a shard of glass, his throat closing around the words he was struggling to say. "No, no, that can't be," Edmund stammered, his words strangled, his mind grasping at something, anything that would deny this truth. Miss Marple's gaze met his, piercing and unrelenting. "It is the cruelest truth of all," she said softly, her voice the calm center of the storm. "Felix Winslow was not dead when they buried him. His condition was undetectable to those who did not wish to look closely, to those who were determined to keep the family's secret hidden. But he was not gone. And when he awoke, when he came back to consciousness in that dark, suffocating place, no one could speak the horror of what he must have felt. The terror that gnawed at his soul, knowing he had been abandoned, left to die alone." Miss Marple paused, letting the gravity of the words settle into the silence. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, almost serene in contrast to the emotional turmoil she had just unleashed. The truth, however unbearable, had been laid bare for all to see. The suffering Felix endured in the final days of his life, alone in that coffin, was a truth none of them could escape. And when death finally came, Miss Marple concluded, her voice dropping to a near whisper, it was a mercy long overdue. The room seemed to pulse with the weight of this revelation. There was no turning back. The truth was out. And the family's dark, twisted secret had finally been exposed. The silence in the room grew thick and suffocating, as Miss Marple's words sliced through the stillness. It was not by illness or misadventure, she continued, her voice a soft yet lethal whisper. It was because someone had buried him alive. Her words reverberated like a dagger being thrust into the heart of the room. Edmund turned away, his breath sharp and ragged, struggling to hold his composure. The horrifying truth now hung over them all like a dense fog, impossible to ignore. Vivienne trembled, her gaze darting nervously toward the door, as if she might somehow escape the damning reality unfolding before her. Dr. Graves closed his eyes tightly, as if hoping to block out the image that had just been planted in his mind. But there was no turning back. Felix Winslow had not simply vanished, had not succumbed to some mysterious illness or unfortunate accident. No, Felix had died alone, in suffocating darkness, with nothing but the heavy weight of the earth pressing down on him. A life stolen, buried alive, and left to rot in the confines of his own coffin. Now at last, the truth had been unearthed. The story of his suffering had finally risen from the depths, and there was no escaping the haunting reality that had been buried for so long. The silence stretched long after Miss Marple's revelation, thick with the weight of the horror just revealed. Edmund, however, broke the silence. His face had turned an ashen gray, his eyes hard as stone, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, his body stiffened with a kind of cold, unrelenting fury. There was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. No fear, only the raw determination of a man who had just learned the most devastating truth of his life. This cannot stand, he muttered through gritted teeth. Vivienne turned sharply toward him, her voice trembling as she whispered, Edmund, please don't do this. But he shook his head with a cold finality. No, my father buried a man alive, he declared, his voice now filled with righteous fury. He stole Felix's life for the sake of his inheritance, and he did it without an ounce of remorse. His voice grew harder, more resolute. He's dead now, but that does not mean justice is beyond reach. Miss Marple watched Edmund carefully, her calm eyes studying the storm that had begun to rage within him. She knew what was coming next. Edmund's exhaled breath was slow but unwavering, as though gathering the strength to carry out what he knew had to be done. The truth must be known, he said with finality. I will go to the authorities. A ripple of tension surged through the room. The weight of a crime that had been buried in the shadows for decades was now being dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of day. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, and for a moment the only sound was the steady crackling of the fire. Miss Marple, ever so calm, allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod. Justice, even when delayed, had a way of finding its path, of clawing its way out of the darkness. Felix Winslow's story would not be left to rot in silence. His suffering would not go unnoticed. The truth would be told, no matter the cost. The quiet village of Greystone would never be the same again. Greystone had always been a place of understated charm, its cobbled streets winding through a landscape that seemed to whisper of centuries gone by. The village felt timeless, its cottages, with ivy creeping up their walls, its stone buildings bathed in the soft glow of evening light. Yet something had shifted. A subtle change had settled in the air, an unease that hung like a shadow over the rooftops. The streets, once comforting in their quiet rhythm, now seemed to pulse with an unspoken tension. Miss Marple, packing her modest bags beside the window of Lady Alana's guest room, gazed out at the village one final time. Below her, the familiar sights of the market square, the quaint stone buildings, and the placid flow of daily life seemed unchanged. But something within her told her that it was not. She could feel it, an almost imperceptible shift in the village's very heartbeat. The weight of the past, long buried and forgotten, had risen again. Felix Winslow, once merely a name tied to an unfortunate accident, was now a figure forever bound to tragedy. No longer just the victim of an untimely death, but the victim of murder, a calculated, deliberate act carried out to secure an inheritance. The revelation was as devastating as it was undeniable, and the village of Greystone, with all its sleepy charm, would never be the same. As Miss Marple folded the last of her belongings, a sigh escaped her lips. She had seen much in her years, more than most ever would, and yet there were still moments that took hold of her, moments that reminded her, as painful as it was, that justice, though sometimes delayed, would always find its way. And this case, like so many others, would not go unanswered. The truth had come to light, but in doing so, it had uncovered scars that would leave a permanent mark on Greystone. Lady Alanna had offered her a place to stay, but Miss Marple knew it was time to leave. She had done what she had come to do, and now it was time to return to her own home. Still there was something in the air, something heavy, that made her hesitate. The village had changed, and she knew its peace would be forever disturbed by the ripples of Felix Winslow's tragic fate. Even after she was gone, the echoes of his story would reverberate through these cobbled streets. As evening descended, casting long haunting shadows over the hills, Miss Marple joined Lady Alanna on the veranda. The sun hung low on the horizon, a golden orb slowly sinking into the earth, painting the sky in hues of deep purple and dusky rose. It was a perfect evening, a serene, peaceful scene, but beneath the beauty of the sunset, a quiet sorrow lingered. Neither woman spoke for a long while, each lost in her own thoughts, the weight of what had transpired too heavy to ignore. Finally, Lady Alanna broke the silence, her voice soft but carrying a weight that matched the atmosphere. She gazed out over the distant fields, her eyes distant as if seeing a future that no longer held the same promise as it once did. "Do you think, Miss Marple, that we ever truly leave the past behind?" she asked, her words drifting in the cool evening air. "Do you think he's at peace now, Miss Marple? Felix, I mean." Lady Alanna's voice broke the heavy silence, her eyes searching Miss Marple's for some sign of reassurance. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she turned to face the woman beside her. "I hope so," she said quietly, "but peace, it's a fragile thing, especially when it's been denied for so long." Her words hung in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Lady Alanna sighed deeply, her hands folding in her lap as though she were cradling the very sorrow of the village. "It seems like such a cruel twist of fate, doesn't it? That a man so full of life, so full of promise, could be buried beneath such a weight, and for what? Greed? A fortune that could have been shared?" She shook her head, the bitterness clear in her voice. Miss Marple nodded in understanding, her voice gentle but firm as she spoke. "It's the way of the world, Lady Alanna. We often find ourselves caught in the web of our own choices, and sometimes the consequences, they're too much to bear." She paused, her mind running over the tangled web of lies, deceit and murder she had unraveled. Felix's life had been stolen. Yes, but justice, even when delayed, has a way of finding its path, even if it takes time. Lady Alanna turned to her, her expression clouded with concern. "And what of Arthur? What of those who buried him?" Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with a quiet, unwavering conviction. "Arthur Winslow may have thought he could bury the truth along with Felix, but no sin remains hidden forever. It will find its way to the surface. Perhaps not in the way we expect, but it will come to light. It always does." Lady Alanna nodded slowly, the weight of Miss Marple's words sinking in. Her gaze drifted to the horizon, the evening sky now a deepening shade of violet. "Do you think, Miss Marple, that Felix has found peace?" A faint smile crossed Miss Marple's lips as she looked out the window, her gaze soft but resolute. "In time, yes. Perhaps not on this earth, but somewhere, somehow, peace will find him." As night fell, a restless wind stirred through the village, causing the ancient trees that lined the pathways to whisper and groan. The wind felt different tonight, heavier, almost as if the very air carried the weight of forgotten memories, stirring them from their long slumbering depths. The village, once peaceful and still, now seemed to thrum with a quiet energy that no one could quite name. Miss Marple stood by the window of her room, gazing out at the darkened streets below. The houses were silent, their windows darkened. The streets, once alive with the quiet hum of daily life, were now empty, desolate. Yet, in the silence, there was something far more profound, a sense that something had shifted, that the past which had been buried and forgotten, had now risen to claim its due. The wind howled, carrying with it the weight of long-held secrets and unspoken regrets. Miss Marple could feel it, the tension that pulsed beneath the stillness of the night, as though the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. In the distance, the wind carried something more than just the usual rustle of leaves. It was as if the very air itself was steeped in an unsettling energy, an energy that spoke of something unfinished, something left behind in the dark corners of Greystone Manor. The hour was late, the quiet hour, when even the bravest souls took shelter from the cold breath of night, but Miss Marple couldn't shake the sensation that something was lingering, something that hadn't been fully resolved. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the night wash over her. The wind had carried more than whispers of nature. It seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be fully revealed, of lives that had been interrupted before their time, and of a truth that remained tantalizingly out of reach. Miss Marple's mind, always sharp and incisive, had pieced together the mystery of Felix's death. Yet, even now there was an unsettling feeling in her chest, an unease she couldn't quite dispel. Felix's story, though revealed in full, still felt incomplete. Some fragments of the puzzle were missing, as though certain truths had been deliberately hidden, just beyond her grasp. The wind howled louder now, as if urging her to search deeper, to reconsider something she may have overlooked. But no, she had done everything she could. Felix's death had been solved, justice would prevail, and the past had been unearthed. Finally, it could rest. But still, as the wind moaned through the trees, and shadows stretched longer in the dim light, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering in the air, something she couldn't name. Perhaps it was just the weight of the past that refused to settle, or perhaps, just perhaps, there was another layer to the mystery that even she had missed. The wind had not died down. Instead, it seemed to creep closer, as though the very night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. She felt a strange pressure in her chest, a tension that had settled over her like a thick fog. The village of Greystone Manor was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the land itself was waiting for the final inevitable conclusion. Compelled by a sudden urge, Miss Marple pulled back the curtains just enough to peer outside, her gaze scanning the grounds below. The moon hung high, casting a pale cold light over the manor, its beams stretching across the landscape like a spectral hand. In the distance, the family crypt stood, an ancient monument to secrets buried long ago. The place had always felt eerie, but tonight, it seemed different, as if the very air around it was heavy with forgotten memories. For a moment, Miss Marple thought she saw something, a flicker in the shadows near the crypt, something that didn't belong. She strained her eyes, watching as the dark form moved again, shifting in a way that seemed deliberate, almost purposeful. The wind, now howling around the manor, seemed to carry it closer, as though beckoning her to look further, to uncover the truth hidden in the gloom. Miss Marple's heart quickened, her breath catching in her throat. Could it be? Had someone or something been lurking near the crypt? A trick of the moonlight? Or was there something else at play here? Something more sinister? She stepped closer to the window, her pulse racing as she watched the shadow move again, unmistakable now. It was a figure, dark and indistinct, but it was moving, almost as if it were trying to stay hidden, creeping near the entrance of the crypt. Miss Marple's mind raced. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. No, this was not the time for wild imaginings. The murderer had been unmasked, Felix's fate had been sealed, and the truth had been revealed. But that shadow, it refused to leave her thoughts. She turned away from the window, drawing the curtains closed, but the feeling lingered. The past, though unearthed, seemed to hover over her like an unshakable fog. The wind continued to howl, the whispers of the night seeming to press against the walls of her mind. Was it the wind she heard? Or was it something more, something that had not been fully revealed, something still hidden in the deepest crevices of the manor? Miss Marple knew that some shadows never truly disappear. They linger, waiting, always there, just out of reach. And as she prepared for bed, the restless air seemed to follow her every step, a constant presence in the room. The wind once again seemed to whisper secrets that had yet to be spoken, secrets that could never be fully laid to rest. Even in the silence of the night, Miss Marple could feel it, the weight of the past pressing in on her, reminding her that the truth was not always as complete as it seemed. Some mysteries, some shadows, could never truly fade away.